or all of the above? We'll bring you takes from all sides, no matter how far apart, over the next 60 minutes.
All he's interested in doing is blaming everyone else. Can't he hear the country screaming at him, get on with your job?
The reason his authority is on the line in this matter is that they take £10 million from the unions, Mr. Speaker.
Pretty punchy Prime Minister's questions today. And as inflation hits a new high, Rishi Sunak says the government is doing what it can to help those who need it.
Now, I want people to be reassured that we have all the tools we need and the determination to reduce inflation and bring it back down.
The Chancellor there. We'll also have some top guests on the programme tonight, including the Deputy Secretary-General of the National Education Union, Niamh Sweeney. We'll also talk to Labour's Shadow Immigration Minister, Stephen Kinnock. And we'll also be talking to the MP, Dean Russell, about his anti-bullying campaign. Plus, we'll have lots more besides, all coming up on The Take. Hello, good evening. With inflation hitting 9.1%, it's no wonder that people want a pay rise. Tomorrow, rail workers will walk out for the second time, causing major disruption. And they're not the only ones threatening industrial action, with teachers also balloting for strikes. But as the government and the unions lock horns, whose side is the public on? We'll be trying to find out on the programme tonight. So let's crack straight on. We're going to start with the best bits of the week so far.
The dead hand of this Tory government is all over this dispute, and the fingerprints of Grant Shapps and the DNA of Rishi Sunak are all over the problems on the railway. Both sets of proposals are unacceptable, and it is now confirmed that the strike action that is planned for this week will go ahead.
Good morning. The biggest walkout of rail staff in over 3 decades is underway, with millions of commuters facing severe disruption.
It's totally unfair. The average train driver earns £59,000. The average rail worker earns £44,000. The average nurse, £31,000. They do not get a bad deal.
We need, I'm afraid, everybody, and I say this to the country as a whole, we need to get ready to stay the course.
Grant Shapps can come to the table if he wants. I'm not particularly bothered. But if he wants to come to the table, he'd be welcome, as long as he comes in a framework of goodwill. What he needs to do, really, is allow the management of the train operating companies and Network Rail the licence to get on with negotiating.
I don't drive, so as a zero-hour contract, basically, if I don't work, I don't get paid. So every time they go on strike, I end up losing money.
The end goal is to get better pay and better conditions. And if this is what we have to do, and I support the workers, then that's what has to be done.
If he's genuine about preventing strikes, will the Prime Minister tell this House how many meetings he or his Transport Secretary have had with rail workers this week to actually stop the strikes?
It is a disgrace when we are planning to make sure that you don't have ticket offices that sell fewer than 1 ticket every hour, Mr. Speaker, that he yesterday had 25 Labour MPs on the picket line, and the shadow deputy leader out on the picket line, Mr. Speaker, backing the strikers, Mr. Speaker, while we back the strivers.
Well, it feels like it's a wedge issue for the government, or at least they hope it is. But I do wonder how this is all going down with the public. Sam Coates, our Deputy Political Editor, is with us. It does feel, doesn't it, as if, both the government and the unions are very happy to kind of lock horns with each other. But where would you say that public opinion is?
It's really fascinating you say that, Sophie, because if you go and talk to MPs in private, on the Conservative side, actually, they see some political upside. Despite all of the misery that so many people are experiencing, they think that by being able to paint the Labour Party as, of course, traditionally the Workers' Party, with historic links to the trade unions, as being on the side of these strikes, and that's not really technically true if you listen to Keir Starmer, but they want to paint the Labour Party as being on the side of these strikes, then there are electoral gains that might convince voters that you can't trust the economy, key questions with Keir Starmer. But the interesting question, Sophie, is that really true? And just how unpopular are these strikes? Now, actually, this week, YouGov have done some polling. It'd be quite interesting to look at some of the results that we've got. And the first question that we asked was, do you support the rail strikes at all? Now, more people oppose the strikes than support them. That's clear. 45% oppose, 37% support. But that figure is just a little bit high. More than a third of the population support those strikes. And I think that shows that there is just some residual sympathy for demands for a pay rise at a point where inflation today, according to the ONS, is 9%.
I guess if people feel in their pockets that they need a pay rise themselves, and they have sympathy with other people potentially asking for one too.
And here's a surprising result. If you just go on to the next slide, we compared the result to just 2 weeks ago, and you can see actually support for the strikes has gone up, despite the fact this poll being taken on the day of the first strike, and those who oppose the strikes have gone down. Now, that's really interesting because it suggests that as cost of living issues come up, as people try to work out what they think about the strikes, it isn't a slam dunk, as some Tory MPs were suggesting to me last night, that this will automatically be a bad thing for the Labour Party, good thing for the Conservatives, and that everybody is revolting against the strikes that unfortunately will be going ahead again tomorrow.
And I guess if the Conservatives are trying to use this as a wedge issue, if you like, then what really matters is where do their swing voters stand? Where do their own supporters stand? Is there any inclination about that?
Yes, absolutely. And so here's one of the most interesting things about the politics of the strikes. If we look at the number of people who say that they were affected by this week's strike. So if you had a little look at this, we have here, have you been impacted, have your travel plans been impacted this week? Just 18% say yes, 76% say no. That's a less than 1 in 5 of the population actually saying that they had a direct negative effect as the result of the strikes. Now, there have been wall-to-wall coverage on Sky News and elsewhere. All the papers have been filled with stories about strikes, but it's not necessarily affecting as many people as perhaps the coverage might indicate. Then look at who amongst the country is particularly affected. If we look at the regional breakdown here, and it will show us that London is the most affected. Now, London, typically a Labour city, lots of commuting, lots of rail use, lots of tube use, tube strike and disruption, slightly separate to the rail strike that we've been experiencing this week. But London and Scotland are the two places that are most affected. But in the areas that are likely to determine a general election, the rest of the south, only 15% affected. That's less than the national average. The Midlands and Wales, 15%. The north, 15%. Those areas, actually, what you find, Sophie, is the people who are affected by these strikes are in urban areas. They're often men, younger men who rely on train journeys. But that just isn't as many people, perhaps, as some of the coverage, some of the hopes of Tory strategists might rely on, because I think that strikes are a difficult issue for so many, but there is real concern that at a time of 9% inflation, and clearly pay rises, nothing like that in the public and the private sector, that the public see this issue as being more complicated.
I have to say, I find it utterly fascinating. And it does feel like in this time, then all of our sort of preconceptions about how these things will go down, we need to be quite alive to movement or being challenged in that as well. Sam, thanks very much. We'll have more from Sam as we go on the programme as well. Now, the really interesting as well, of course, is that we've been focusing, of course, on the rail strikes so far. But it does feel as if the strikes could spread to other industries too. Big news for parents and pupils, because teaching unions have said that they will strike in the autumn unless their pay better matches inflation. The National Education Union has written to the Education Secretary, Nadine Zahawi, to say that they'll campaign in favour of industrial action unless the government recommends what they describe as an inflation plus pay rise. Well, we can speak now to the Deputy Secretary-General of the National Education Union, Niamh Sweeney. Thank you so much for being on the programme. Do you feel like a teacher strike is inevitable?
I think it's more likely than it's been in my 20 years of working in the profession. Even before the pandemic, teachers were working more unpaid overtime than any other profession. And when early career teachers calculate their hourly pay, they're often being paid under the living wage. As a graduate profession, the pay simply hasn't kept up with other graduate professions. And teachers are saying to us that they are finding it difficult to get to the end of the month. Their heating bills and their fuel bills mean that they are struggling to survive.
Yeah, I mean, look. Don't think anyone would say that times are easy, particularly, of course, for people who've had years of pay restraint. I'm just interested to know exactly what you're calling for. So you say you want an inflation plus pay rise. Inflation, of course, is currently at 9.1%. What is the pay rise that you want to see?
Well, at the moment, we think that the STRB is likely to recommend to the Secretary of State about a 3% pay increase. Now, with CPI or RPI, that means an actual pay cut for our members of between 6 and 8%. And of austerity and pay restraint and last year's pay freeze. So the average teacher will have lost between 17 and 20% in real terms of their wages. So if they don't offer something that is more than at least CPI inflation, the majority of teachers will be facing another year of a pay cut.
So let's just be really, really clear then on what you're calling for. Inflation is currently at 9.1%. So just spell it out for us. What is it that you want to see?
We've said to Nadeem Sahawi today that he needs to very seriously consider an above-inflation pay rise for teachers across the board, and it needs to be fully funded. So we need to make sure that schools are able to pay this, because what we're seeing is a teacher recruitment and retention crisis. 1 in 4 teachers leaves the profession within 2 years, and 1 in 3 teachers leaves within 5. And that means that children and young people are less likely.
You want to see a pay rise of over 9.1%, that's correct, is it?
We have to make sure that teachers aren't having another year of a pay cut. And that's what they've been suffering for the last 10 years, plus the pay freeze that was issued last year to all of the public sector.
What exactly are you calling for?
So we have said that we're calling for an above inflation pay fully funded pay rise for all teachers and all education workers. We mustn't forget that support staff wages have not kept up with those of retail or hospitality, and support staff members in our schools work with some of our most vulnerable children and those with special educational need and disability. If the government doesn't address teacher pay, then it is going to face an even bigger workforce crisis than it is in at the moment. And what we are seeing is children in secondary school having 3 or 4 maths teachers within a year. I've got a friend who's a physics teacher who started after Easter, and every time he comes to the end of a lesson, the children say to him, "Sir, are you coming back next week?" Children need a qualified, experienced teacher who is committed to the profession, that isn't worried about whether they can pay their mortgage, that isn't worried about whether they can fill their car with petrol at the end of the month, and isn't facing £2,000 hike in their own childcare fees. We're a profession of 76% women who have suffered through austerity and have suffered through the pandemic. There's a pay gap and a pension gap, and children and families and schools deserve better.
OK, so pretty clear then that you're going to be balancing for action. You want to see an above-inflation pay rise. So reading between the lines of what you said, that's effectively double figures, above 9.1%. So my other question is, children have lost so much education time already because of the pandemic. And we know that it's the most deprived children who've suffered because of that. According to the Sutton Trust, social mobility fell by 12% thanks to the lost learning during the pandemic. How comfortable are you that if teachers do go on strike, that's going to be more lost hours for children in the classroom and more disruption, particularly, for those underprivileged children?
Teachers are acutely aware of the impact that them taking strike action would have on children. That's why they would never take it lightly. And that's why, it's taken this crisis for them to be considering it. But I've spoken to more teachers this week who have said that they would, for the first time in their career, consider taking strike action, because they recognise that it's not just about the pay in their pockets. It's about recruiting graduate teachers into the profession and keeping teachers in the profession so that children have a well-qualified, experienced teacher teaching them. We've seen, you're right, the children who are most deprived, it's often the fact that they are coming from families that the educational disadvantage is already in place before they reach school. So if the government is really true to its word about levelling up, it will invest in early years education and invest in fully funded pay increase that keeps teachers in the classroom.
OK. I've spoken to Mick Lynch of the RMT at the weekend, who said that they're effectively prepared to keep striking until they get what they are asking for when it comes to pay. I just wonder if that's the same for teachers. How long could the strikes last for?
Well, we haven't had a pay offer from the employer yet, so we are hoping that the Department of Education, that Niamh Zahawi would read our letter today, will hear the news stories and all the interviews of teachers that I've heard on the news and radio.
The question is how long. The question is, sorry to try and get back to the question, but the question is how long could the strikes last for?
Well, we haven't even balloted yet, Sophie, so that's why we're putting this warning out. This is the strength of the feeling and the crisis of the cost of living that we are in right now. We have said that we are committed from our conference in Easter to run an indicative ballot in the autumn term, and we will be recommending to our members that they vote yes for strike action. That's a warning.
I understand that we're early in the process, but I know that parents will be. I know that parents will be really concerned about the idea of staff going on strike, even though, of course, many, I guess, would understand the desire for better pay. Are we talking days? Are we talking weeks? Are we talking months? Or do we just not know?
That will be down to our members and what they decide they are willing and prepared to do. But I tell you what parents are also concerned about. Parents are concerned that teacher vacancies are up by 14%. Parents are concerned that their children their class sizes are rising because classes are having to be merged because teacher vacancies aren't being filled. And parents are concerned that their children are being taught by non-subject specialists. We're finding it more difficult to recruit IT teachers that need to develop curriculum that's vital for our economy and vital for young people entering into the workforce and the next phases of their educational career. That's what parents are extremely worried about. And Niamh Zahawi needs to hear that call and needs to ensure that teacher pay maintains its balance with other graduate professions, and that we are getting the right number of teachers to come into the profession and keeping teachers once they get there.
OK, thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme and explaining your position to us. That was Niamh Sweeney of the National Education Union. Well, it certainly feels that it could be not just the rail workers who are striking. From that interview, it certainly feels as though perhaps it's an inevitability that teachers will too. So I'm quite interested now to try and get more of a sense about how people are feeling about the strikes. We can talk to our regular panel of viewers on the programme. We talk to people from across the UK, across the political spectrum as well. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all here today. And I'm interested to get your views on the strikes, of course, as well. Let's start off with Tom Horne, shall we? On the rail strikes, I think we should start off with. Now, Tom, you're 19, you're at university. You have been one of the 18% that Sam Coates was talking about earlier, where your plans have been disrupted by the rail strikes. What's happened?
Yes, so I was meant to be going home from uni this week, but because of the strike, that's not possible because I go to uni in Leeds and I live in Cornwall, and all trains to Cornwall have been cancelled past a certain point, and obviously there's just general disruption everywhere. So I've not been able to do that. So I had to go last week and for a shorter amount of time and at very short notice, which kind of wreaked havoc with my work and my job. But yeah, I managed to get home at the end, but it took a lot of a lot of different planning.
I'm glad that you did manage to get home. Your audio was a little bit wobbly for us there, Tom, so I will try and come back to you later if you view on the strike, but it did feel, got the gist of what you were saying, that you had to change your travel plans back home because of the strikes today. So let's talk, shall we, to Belinda, shall we? Belinda Campbell, you're Twickenham, you're a swing voter, you describe yourself as, don't you? Now, you're again someone who has been quite impacted by what's happening in the railways. You told our producer that you're self-employed, but you've actually started turning down work because you effectively just don't trust the transport system.
Yeah, and I've since the pandemic, I've decided to try and work from home as much as possible, and there are opportunities out there. I mean, in the pandemic, I think the government should have provided opportunities for people to work at home, but I would rather not travel on the trains and and overcrowded, expensive trains. I do understand why people strike, because it's a powerful mechanism. But it has such a knock-on effect. The bigger picture is, it sends like shockwaves through the economy and affects so many people, such a range of people. So I know they feel that's the only choice they have, but I think there has to be some consideration in there too. But it's a very powerful message, and so I understand. I think the public do understand as well why people strike.
It's interesting. It feels like you're a little bit split on it, effectively, understanding some of why people strike, but at the same time feeling, the disruption of it as well. Let's talk to Vic Daniels, shall we? Let's bring in Vic Daniels at this point, because I feel like you've got a bit of a different take on this, perhaps. You are someone who you're quite critical of the strikes. Talk to me about how you feel about the railway strikes.
Well, I mean, I've got nothing personal against Mike Lynch or the RMT, but I just don't think they should be allowed to hold the country to ransom. I think it's only the prison workers and the police who are legally prevented from striking, and I personally believe that list needs to be extended.
And is that because of the disruption that it causes people or the impact on the economy?
Yeah, I mean, looking at Sky News this morning, there was some stuff on there about a social care worker that wasn't able to get in to look after the elderly. We've heard stories about students who haven't been able to make it into their exams, with people that have had long COVID delays in terms of appointments are also finding that they've had to cancel their interviews and probably won't get rescheduled for several months. I just don't think this is right. And I don't think that one union or one set of professionals should be able to, as I say, hold the country to ransom. It's wrong.
I'm quite keen to broaden the discussion out a little bit now to education, because I know that the rest of you have, some views on this, either you're working in the education profession or you've got kids at school. Let's bring in Rob, shall we? Rob Tyler. Now, Rob, you're a Conservative voter, you're from Bolton, but you have got experience in the education profession. I'm interested to know your view on whether you've got sympathy with teachers who are considering strike action.
Well, I actually take issue with what Niamh Sweeney said then. She talks about pay gaps and pension gaps, but teachers that are working for further education colleges, most people don't know this, and I imagine most mainstream education teachers don't know this, but further education college teachers that do exactly the same job as sixth form college teachers, teaching A-levels and BTEC, get paid thousands per year less than their colleagues doing exactly the same job. And to be honest, it's actually ridiculous. The Education Secretary put forward a 3% pay suggestion. The AOC met with the union recently, with the NEU recently, and the NEU asked for a 10% pay rise, and they've been offered an improved offer of 2.5%. So if the mainstream get the 3%, just the 3%, they'll still get more than the FE teachers will get, and widen that pay gap even further.
And that's you, isn't it? You're a science teacher. You're a science teacher, aren't you? So that impacts you, doesn't it?
It does indeed. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Really interesting. Well, let's talk to Lisa Goddard now, shall we? Lisa, you're a university lecturer. You've trained teachers up, so you've got a bit of a feel about how where they're at, I guess, when it comes to strikes. What's your view? Do you think the strikes in the education profession are effectively inevitable now?
I just go back to our previous person who spoke, and he is right that further education and higher education get paid less than teachers. Not trying to move away from the teachers' point there, because Sophie, remind me of your question again. Do I think that they will strike?
Do you think do you think it's inevitable? Do you think that they will strike?
It's been a long time in education without pay rises because of inflation and austerity and pay freeze, and I can see why teachers need it now. I know teachers that are going to food banks. Things are really difficult in the education system, but teachers love the job, they care about the kids. It will be really difficult for them to strike. And also you have to remember that when you can't afford when you can't afford things as it is, going on strike actually it's difficult financially for teachers to go on strike because you lose pay. You would only go on strike if it's an absolute last resort. And maybe actually the country is getting there, and maybe we will see strikes.
It's really interesting. Well, great to talk to two people in the education profession. Let's talk to a parent now, shall we? Hannah Walker, you're a Labour voter, you're from Dorset. You've got a 12-year-old son. So obviously, if teachers walk out, that's going to impact you as a parent. Would you support teacher strikes?
Absolutely. I think any workforce has the right to withdraw its labour if it needs to get a decent pay rise. And I think the point about further and higher education staff is that their wages should rise. We have a lot of people on very low wages. We have high employment, but a lot of people on low wages. They should be paid more, but that doesn't mean that teachers shouldn't get what they deserve. It just illustrates exactly that. We have high employment rather, and people aren't being paid enough to shelter these costs of inflation, petrol costs, everything else. It points to a bigger problem there, I think, than just certain sectors. There are lots of people who have very low paid jobs who should be paid more.
Yeah, that's the point, isn't it, I guess? So the fact that, there are lots of people who, particularly at time of high inflation, are going to be asking for a pay rise. I know that some of you are probably quite torn on this, so feel free to not put your hand up if you are, but just raise your hand if you're generally supportive of the strikes. 1, 2 hands going up there. And if you're generally against the strikes, put your hands up. 1, 2... There you go. Well, it's a bit split, isn't it? Interesting stuff. Thank you so much for coming on and giving your view. Interesting to really try and sort of drill into some of that public opinion on strikes. You're watching The Take. We are live right here in Westminster. Up next, we're going to have the latest on some calls for the SNP's Westminster leader Ian Blackford to resign over his handling of a sexual harassment allegation.
Big stories don't always come from big cities. I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent, and this is where I grew up. We can reveal that the driver who hit Harry Dunn is 42-year-old Anne Sakoulas.
Just met the president and we never thought we'd get this far.
This is what they're up against, that the wind is the really big problems. It is back-breaking work and the smoke is thick. It's been working well. Water levels are dropping, but no one knows what impact further rain will have. What would you do if this place wasn't open? We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
It's really scary. We're terrified.
In this community, I'm told that everybody knows someone affected by COVID.
Hopefully this will be the last wave.
I never knew they would make it. It's amazing.
Change seems tantalisingly close in this corner of the UK. Wales was the first to introduce the plastic bag charge. This is my patch, my specialism. It's also my home.
Con eso ya podemos ir evaluando entonces cómo el cambio climático va a afectar estos ecosistemas. Y eso cómo afecta prácticamente toda la cadena. O sea, si afectamos a los productores primarios, que son las microalgas, vamos a ver afectado obviamente todo el resto de los organismos.
We support communities to grow food in lost and unloved spaces across the city. So our main kind of driving force is to get people growing.
The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.
Hello, welcome back live to Westminster. You're watching The Take. Now, there's been some growing criticism of the SNP's Westminster leader in Blackford over how he handled a sexual harassment allegation against another MP. Our political correspondent Liz Bates has been looking into the story for us. And Liz, just give us a background to what happened.
Well, first of all, Sophie, this dates back to something that took place in 2016, a party that was attended by a very young member of SNP staff. He was at that party subjected to some unwanted sexual advances from an SNP MP, Patrick Grady. Now, fast forward a few years, he took that to the Parliament's independent complaints process. That was upheld. Patrick Grady apologised. He was suspended for 2 days. Since that happened, a lot more has emerged around this story, and the spotlight has really turned to how the SNP deal with these types of allegations, and in particular, their leader, Ian Blackford. And that's really for two reasons. First of all, a leaked recording of a meeting with Ian Blackford and his MPs emerged, in which he encouraged those MPs to really rally round and show support, not for the victim, but for the perpetrator, Patrick Grady. The other issue is his approach to this incident when he first heard about it. So what we understand from the staff member is that at the time he was called into Ian Blackford's office. He wasn't aware of what that meeting was going to be about. In that meeting, he was confronted with Patrick Grady. Now, he believes now that was entirely inappropriate. I was speaking to that staff member on an anonymous basis, and I think we should hear from him.
And when I walked into his office, I've got Ian Blackford, the leader of my party that I work for, and I've got the chief whip of the party I work for, and also my line manager crying in front of me, apologising. I was made to feel guilty in that situation. I felt bad for him in that situation. Looking back, I know that's irrational now. But at the time, I felt like I had no choice but to accept the apology. And to be honest, I was scared at the time that it would affect my career. And honestly, since with what's coming out since then, I was right to fear that, because it's exactly what's happened.
There have been calls after what's happened to you has emerged, and we've seen the failures at different stages for Ian Blackford to resign. Is that how you feel?
Yes, I think Ian's position right now is untenable, and it will continue to be so the longer this goes on. It will only get worse.
So you see the victim telling you that he thinks that Ian Blackford's position is untenable. Have we heard anything from Ian Blackford on this?
Well, we've heard a little bit from Ian Blackford. He hasn't made a public statement on camera. He doesn't want to come and be interviewed, but we have had a written statement from him in which he's apologised for what happened. He's also said that there'll be an external review of the SNP's processes for dealing with this, suggesting that there'll be a big overhaul. Many opposition MPs, as you can imagine, have been very critical of him, some suggesting that even calling into question his future. And we spoke earlier today to Labour's Ian Murray, who is the Shadow Scotland Secretary, and this is what he said.
Ian Blackford's apology or non-apology yesterday was essentially victim blaming. If we want to try and find a way of changing the culture within politics, within Westminster and in wider society, then those in leadership positions have to take the responsibility, and I think he really should consider his position.
There's been a lot of discussion, hasn't there, in Westminster about culture and about how these allegations are dealt with. I know it's something you personally have been looking into as well. Do you think there is a culture problem, and is any change happening?
Well, I have to say, I mean, you've been around in Westminster quite a long time as well, Sophie.
Yeah,
you know, this is something that we talk about every now and then. It comes up and there's big promises about, you know, that things will change and that culture will really be addressed. But, I mean, you only have to look to the next couple of days. We've got two by-elections coming up. The reason that those two MPs have stood down, first of all, in Wakefield, that MP was found guilty of sexually assaulting a teenager. In Tiverton and Honiton, the MP stood down because he was caught watching porn in the House of Commons. So we do now have this independent complaints process. It was brought in a few years ago. Clearly, it's not entirely stamping out what is going on here, and I think there needs to be much more done if we're ever going to address this problem of culture.
Yeah, I think you're right, aren't you, that it does seem to just come around periodically, and there's lots of strong words, but then when it comes to action, no one can really agree on anything. Liz, thank you so much. Really important story to bring you this evening. You are watching The Take. We are live right here in Westminster. Up next, we're going to hear our question of the week, where we give a backbencher a chance to respond to the Prime Minister.
I'm Yvan Bourgnon, I'm a sailor. I spent half time of my life on the sea. We have a factory who can convert this plastic to energy. And so after, at the end, we can minimize the footprint carbon of the boat.
Hello, welcome back live to Westminster. You are watching The Take. Let's take a look now to look at Prime Minister's questions. Keir Starmer's been on pretty punchy form recently. Today was no different as the two leaders clashed at the dispatch box. We can have a look now at PMQs Unwrapped with our own political correspondent, Ali Fortescue.
A day until the long-awaited by-elections in Wakefield in Yorkshire and Tiverton and Honiton in Devon, it was a rowdy PMQs, with both Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson keen to get in their pre-election pitch.
He's crashed the economy, he's put everybody's tax up. The last Tory sent up to Wakefield being convicted of a sexual assault. That's not much of a pitch, Prime Minister.
People of this country and the people of Wakefield, people of Tiverton and Honiton would much rather vote for a solid Conservative government than for a Labour Party. They're enablers and acolytes in the Liberal Democrats, Mr. Speaker. The chameleons, the karma chameleons of British politics.
Before the pitch, though, came the punchy first question from Labour's Chris Elmore about claims Carrie Johnson was offered a top job in the Foreign Office.
Prime Minister, has he ever considered the appointment of his current spouse to a government post or to any organisation in one of the royal households?
I know why the party opposite wants to talk about non-existent jobs in the media, Mr. Speaker, because they don't want to talk about what's going on in the real world.
Last week, the Labour leader was criticised for avoiding big divisive issues like the rail strikes. This week, he engaged when the PM accused Labour of backing the strikes.
The Prime Minister of this country and his Transport Secretary haven't attended a single meeting, held a conversation or lifted a finger to stop these strikes.
The reason his authority is on the line in this matter is that they take £10 million from the unions. He's standing with the strikers, Mr. Speaker, and lifting the cost of transport for everybody. That's the reality.
Keir Starmer's questions this week were focused on the economy and strikes. Our analysis of his language shows that the word he used most was pay. He also used words like Wakefield, bankers, people, cut, government. The Prime Minister used words like pounds, country and railways. Boris Johnson knows the strikes are tricky ground for Labour. And there was a notable absence behind the Speaker's chair today. Yesterday, Labour whip Niamh Mishra disobeyed Keir Starmer's order that his front bench shouldn't join the picket line. Today, he was missing from his usual spot.
If he is genuine.
Meanwhile, on the Tory benches, plenty of cheering and pointing. Unity on the subject of industrial action. And from the great government critic, the SNP's in Blackford, a muted appearance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister?
His first PMQs since apologising for backing a colleague suspended for sexual misconduct. The Prime Minister, though, was keen at any opportunity to steer onto rail strikes.
When is he going to stop meaningless sound bites and instead start supporting working people across our country?
If she wants to support the working people of this country, Mr. Speaker, can I suggest she gets off the picket line?
A summer of strikes could mean political pain for Labour, but widespread commuter misery isn't good for the government either. For now, though, all eyes are on two very different, long-awaited by-elections tomorrow.
Ali Fortescue there. Now, we have a regular slot on the programme to talk to a backbencher and we pick a PMQ of the week, the one that caught our eye during the session earlier. Let's have a look at today's one.
Sadly, bullying can have a long-lasting effect on mental health and well-being. So today, the Diana Award are raising awareness about bullying in schools and online, and with the Don't Face It Alone campaign. So will the Prime Minister please join me in encouraging any young person experiencing bullying to speak up and speak out?
Can I thank him very much and congratulate him on his own campaign on this issue. I think everybody understands that bullying is an absolutely appalling experience and something that we should not tolerate in our society. And I'm delighted to see so many colleagues, so many honourable members wearing their blue ribbons today, Mr. Speaker. We should all speak out against bullying, but we should also make sure that we give everybody the courage to speak out against bullying as well.
Now, of course, usually the questioner doesn't get the chance to respond to the PM's answer, but we're trying to put that right. So today we can talk to the Conservative MP for Watford, Dean Russell, who put that question to the Prime Minister. Thank you for being with us. I can see you're sporting your blue ribbon. An enormous amount of MPs were doing the same at PMQs today. What did you make of what the Prime Minister said to you?
Well, it's great to have Number 10 and the Prime Minister's backing of this fantastic campaign. You know, the campaign itself is in over about 2,500 schools. I believe 1.5 million young people are taking part in UK youth charity, the Diana Rewards activities, and in particular around the Don't Face It Alone campaign. So the opportunity to have the backing of Number 10, they did an event, I believe, on Monday, which featured people like Rio Ferdinand talking about their experiences and their work with young people, but also the opportunity to raise awareness. And I very much appreciate you having me on tonight to tell people that, you know, don'tfaceitalone.com. If you go there, you can get lots of free resources for schools, teachers, parents, lesson plans, videos, and really it's about raising awareness. And I was so fortunate that Mr. Speaker chose me as the very last question to come in right at the end and share awareness of this fantastic campaign.
I've been really struck with some of the interviews that I've done recently, and also some of the stories that have been shared on social media by some pretty high-profile MPs about their own experiences of bullying. And I know it can be quite a difficult thing to talk about because it's one of those things that people tend to kind of bury quite deeply inside because it's very painful. You know, I spoke to Nadeem Zahawi, the Education Secretary, who was talking about being chased around a park and dunked underwater in the pond by bullies. Brandon Lewis, the Northern Ireland Secretary, tweeting today saying that he was bullied as a teenager. He's dyslexic, he was overweight, he was seen as an easy target. Older kids thought I was too stupid to succeed, too fat to be taken seriously. You know, how important is it, do you think, that people in these positions are open about some of the difficulties that they faced when they were younger?
I think it's incredibly important, and it's great to see colleagues be so open about it. I mean, I've been campaigning on mental health and mental wellbeing for quite a while now, and I was fortunate in the session to promote the initiative in Watford that I do to train 1,000 mental health first aiders with some fantastic organisations, including the Watford and West Herts Chamber of Commerce, who help deliver that with volunteers. And the key theme on it all is sharing one's experiences, learning from others, talking about it, and not being afraid to share that, because I think the challenge we've seen in society is there is a stigma, and there has always been a stigma, sadly, around mental health, and in particular around bullying. And I think actually what this campaign's trying to do is get people to talk about it, to don't face it alone, as it's called, and as the main phrase of it. But actually what it's about is to speak out, but also to speak up. And if you're seeing bullying in the school or your friends and someone's struggling because of it, you know, support them, speak up about it, and let people know, because invariably, when I've spoken to children about this and young people, when they do make that move, actually it totally removes the bully's power.
Okay.
And actually the power that the bullies often have is to keep people silenced and keep them, you know, so in their control. And actually that's where you can speak up and diminish that.
So important, really important. Thank you so much for coming on. Really important interview to give. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Keir Starmer has been treading a careful line on the strikes. He hasn't condemned them. He also has told Labour MPs not to show support by appearing on picket lines. Not necessarily the most successful in doing that. Well, we spoke today to the Shadow Immigration Minister, Stephen Kinnock, who was on the programme today. I started by asking him if he backed the strikes.
What we need to do is keep focused on the government, because it is the government's job to make these talks work. It's actually in the contract between train operators and the government that industrial action should only take place at the direction of the government, and the decisions the operators make should be at the direction of the Secretary of State for Transport. But Boris Johnson and Grant Shapps have been completely absent from these talks and from this process, and that's because they want these strikes to happen. So I think our job as Labour MPs, as the Parliamentary Labour Party, is to stay focused on the government, to make it clear that it's the government's job to get people round the table. And that, I think, has to be the singular focus of what we're saying and doing in Parliament.
It's pretty clear that that's the kind of line from Labour. I guess what I'm still struggling to understand is Labour's actual position on the strikes. I'll rephrase it. If you are an RMT member, would you be voting for action?
Yes, I would be, because I think that the there is the right to strike, and it's really important that workforces have that right to strike. We believe that rail workers, health workers, people working in every industry that has done so much as well to keep our economy going through the pandemic have the right to strike and to fight for a better deal. And what was really incredible today was to learn that the government is looking to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. So whilst they're preaching to those who've kept our economy going through the pandemic that they have to exercise wage restraint, they are telling the bankers that it's all right to just carry on raking it in. It's breathtaking hypocrisy. And I think what we really saw today is where the government's priorities lie. We believe in working people getting a good deal in terms of pay, terms and conditions. A strike is a last resort for getting that, but sometimes that's what you have to do.
Well, I mean, listening to you, it sounds like you do agree with, their right to strike. You're pro-worker, that if you're an RMT member, you would vote to strike, that people deserve to, get paid at the level that they should be. Do you think that Keir Starmer's misjudged it a bit then? Because actually, if you look at the polling, there is more support for the strikes than perhaps some would expect. 37% support them, according to YouGov. Do you think he's misjudged the public mood?
I think he's got it absolutely right, actually, because he has said very clearly that his job and the job of Labour MPs and the parliamentary party is to keep the focus on the government.
Oh, come on, though. He hasn't backed. He's been very careful not to back the strikes, to tell Labour MPs that they shouldn't be joining picket lines and to effectively, move away from the debate.
We need to keep our fire on the Conservative government and the way in which they have failed to get these strikes off get the talks off the ground to stop these strikes from happening. And the reason is because they want the strikes to happen. Keir, I think, has called that out really effectively, and I think the way he's done that has really cut through with the British people. OK, so you're saying that you want the government to get involved, to get around the negotiating table. So what would Labour do then? The RMT wants to see a pay rise of 7% to effectively match inflation last year when they were being negotiated. Would you agree to a 7% pay rise? It's not our job as Labour MPs to tell the RMT what is a deal that they would accept. I'm asking if you were in government, you are asking the government to get involved. If you were in government, would you accept a 7% pay rise? It's also not the job of government to publicly say what the outcome of negotiations should be. Those negotiations have to take place around a table where there's trust between all of the key parties. Are you happy with a 7% pay rise, though? Do you think that's in the right ballpark? Well, the RMT has to be very clear on what its bottom line is and to be able to take a deal back to its workforce that can be approved. And it's for the workforce to know. They are the hard-working people in our rail industry that have kept our economy going through the pandemic.
You can't say whether or not they deserve a 7% rise.
They know better than we do what is the best deal for them and what works for them.
OK. Teaching unions are also balloting for strike action. We've heard from the unions there that they want, in their words, an inflation-busting pay rise, 11.7%. Currently, the offer is 3%. Would you agree to an 11.7% rise for teachers?
What we've seen is people taking a real terms pay cut, and inflation, of course, plays a role in that. But what I would first of all say is, should those bankers be having the cap lifted on their bonus?
Talk about that.
Should the people running Network Rail who are making over £500,000 a year, let's have some levelling up in the salaries. Let's have some levelling up and some justice in the way in which our economy works. So what does justice look like? We know that you would like to see the cap on bankers' bonuses. We know that you think that the chief executive of Network Rail is paid too much. 11.7% for teachers, is that fair? I think we have to have a deal for the teaching unions to take back to their members that they would find acceptable. Specifically on the public sector, would you like to see pay rises for the public sector matching inflation? I want to see the public sector getting a fair deal, and that is something they have not had for many, many years. We've had 12 years of Tory austerity, 12 years of public sector pay freezes. And that has led us to a situation where the workforce is demotivated, demoralised. They pulled out all the stops to get our country through the pandemic, and they deserve some justice and they deserve some fair play. And I think that that's not that much to ask. So the government has to be ready to come forward with a policy on pay that is going to work for public sector workers, but they also need to have policies to grow our economy.
What's Labour's policy on pay then?
Well, we're not in government, so we need to see the government engaging with the public sector, but we've been clear that a public sector pay freezes were not the right way to go, and we've been clear all the way through that the public sector pay should be in line with inflation. Now, of course, we're seeing inflation going through the roof, and so we are going to have a compromise which is based on giving people the fairest possible deal that we can get in difficult economic circumstances. But we also need to see the government taking action to get inflation down. That means getting a much better deal in terms of trading with the European Union than we currently have, because the price of imports are going through the roof. It means taking VAT off energy bills. It means growing the economy, investing in productive sectors like wind farms and insulating people's homes so that you actually create good jobs, driving up productivity. That's the only way to really deal with inflation in the long term and have much more sustainable growth. So the government has to do these two things: a fair deal for our workers combined with pro-growth and pro-sustainability policies.
Another busy show. That is it for The Take. We'll be back next week and every week on Wednesday at 9 p.m. Next up, Sky News at 10.
The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.
I'm Yvan Bourgnon, I'm a sailor. I spent half time of my life on the sea. We have a factory who can convert this plastic to energy. And so after, at the end, we can minimize the footprint carbon of the boat.